Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amrys Williams. I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut League of Museums and really pleased to welcome you to today's program. Yes, you can, How to Tell a Compelling Advocacy Story. We are so pleased to be partnering with the Connecticut Arts Alliance on this program. And bringing together our memberships on what is something that is common to both our sectors of the cultural sector, the need to advocate and to tell a compelling story about what we do and why it matters. So with us today, in addition to Emily Collins, the League's Membership and Programs Manager, who will be manning the recording, monitoring the chat, sending out the follow-up email to all of you, we have Brett Thompson, who's the Executive Director of the Connecticut Arts Alliance, and Alyssa Calhoun, the CAA's Communications Manager. So I want to thank all of them at the top for all the hard work that each of you did to pull this program together. We're really excited to be doing this in partnership. And I want to thank each and every one of you for showing up today for this important topic, which I think will serve us all in the months and years ahead. So if you have any questions as we go, you can pop them in the chat or raise your hand, but we'll have time hopefully for some good Q&A at the end. And I am going to hand things over to Brett, who's going to kick off our presentation.
Great, thanks, Amrys. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to just do a quick screen share here and we'll get going. Just a little bit about the agenda for today. I think Amrys talked about the housekeeping a bit, but we're going to do this in two parts. The first is to talk about the testimony process. So testimony is part of our voice at the legislature, and it's part of public hearings. So we're going to talk about how to find public hearings, how to find testimony instructions so you know when and where to submit testimony. And then we'll talk a little bit about the two different kinds: written testimony, which gets submitted, and then oral testimony, which we do in person, either Zoom or actually at the LOB. And then I'll turn it over to Amrys. She'll talk about how to tell a compelling advocacy story. So we'll talk about the steps involved. We'll talk about what the what the format looks like, how to put together sort of a compelling story. So those are the two pieces. As Amrys mentioned, ask questions anytime. This is very informal. Probably best to raise your hand so that folks can see you. I'll put a question in the chat. It will be shared afterwards, the recorded session, and then there will be resources shared with you as well as in addition to the recorded session. And share the recording, share the materials that we provide to you with your boards, with your colleagues, with your friends, with your family, whoever needs to be involved in advocacy for arts and culture. So before we begin, I just want to make it clear that we as nonprofits can advocate. I hear a lot of people saying, well, I'm not allowed to do that. I'm a nonprofit. It is part of our work. It is part of what we need to be doing. So I just want to be clear that we can advocate as nonprofits. Things we can't do, we can't, as nonprofits, be involved specifically in campaigns and door knocking, supporting specific candidates, contributing or donating. Those are things we do as private citizens, hosting lawn signs. But as organizations, we can do a lot of things, right? We can advocate, we can communicate with elected decision makers. We can go to public hearings and testify, which is what today's about. We can mobilize our contacts. We can offer research and data to support policy positions. If you have any questions about how advocacy works in the state of Connecticut, I encourage you to contact the State Office of Ethics. They are amazing. They're a really great organization. They're very friendly. They answer questions. They run webinars of their own on lobbying and ethics. So give them a shout if you have any questions. So let's talk about the testimony process, how to testify at a public hearing. So there's really two ways to learn about when a public hearing is going to take place. Action alerts are the easiest way. So at CAA and at the League, we issue action alerts. You can sign up for them. There's two links here that will be shared with you afterwards. We tell you about when it's going to happen, where it's going to happen, what some talking points are, why it's important for whatever the issue that we're talking about. There are easy instructions there. lots of good information. We try to make it as easy and straightforward as possible. The other way you can do it is through this Connecticut General Assembly bill tracker. So that's something that they offer where you can sign up kind of like doing a search on the internet, I guess, where you can enter keywords, you can enter bill numbers, you can enter legislators' names, and the bill tracking system will tell you when something happens. And that's a good place if there are bills or issues that you want to track that aren't those that we're following at CEA or at the League. So those are two ways to learn about them. And then how to find testimony instructions. So testimony is there's set instructions that go along with how you sign up, how you submit. So the General Assembly has something it calls the bulletin. That's where all the public hearings are posted. So all you do is go to that website, click on the public hearings tab, scroll down to the day and time and the committee for your particular hearing that you're looking for. And you'll see that the public hearing notice has links and due dates and instructions in it. So this is what one looks like. It looks kind of complicated, but a couple things to point out here. One is that they're usually broadcast live. So there's a link that folks can follow online. There's a way to sign up for online testimony. So that's the online testimony registration form. There's days and times. There are deadlines for when things need to be submitted. And then for online testimony, so written testimony, there's a way to submit. There's a link to submit online. So again, if you follow our action alerts, all of this information is provided in a simple way. You don't have to read through all this stuff, but we wanted to show you what one looks like when it's listed on the bulletin. Okay, so two kinds of testimony that we can submit. One is written testimony, which is what it sounds like. You write testimony, there's a link that you can go to, you can submit your testimony. It can be submitted anytime before the public hearing or after, but obviously it's preferable before. Legislators do read written testimony. They look at it to see if people are opposed or supporting whatever the issue happens to be. They'll read through and see what people are talking about, so they have an understanding of what the voters are thinking. It can be in the form of a form letter. So maybe you have an organization, you have letterhead with your board members on it. That'd be a good way for legislators to see who's behind what you're talking about. Or it can be in a public testimony format, which Amrys will talk about a little later. It is public record, so it's listed on the General Assembly website for everyone to see. As I mentioned, there's a link that's provided in the action alert of the public hearing. It's a pretty simple process to upload your testimony, and it's all published on the CGA website, the General Assembly website. So a couple of things about written testimony. There's no limit to the size within reason, as there is with oral testimony. So you can put things in written testimony that you may not have time to deliver in public testimony. But you can use written testimony to kind of be the bigger picture of what you want to say if you're going to do oral testimony. And just a tip here is do not post your testimony anonymously. There is a way to do that, but it's kind of a, I don't think legislators pay attention to anonymous testimony. So you definitely want to have your name associated with it. You want to have your organization if you're representing an organization. And so written testimony, as I mentioned, it's listed on the CGA website. This is how you would go find it. So you would go to their website. The link is here. You would click on committees at the top of the navigation bar. Then you'd look for the committee that's holding the public hearing. So let's say for this, we're looking at the Appropriations Committee. So you would look under Appropriations. And then you would look for public hearings in the records. So you see down here, public hearings, and here is testimony. If you click on the testimony link, you will see something that looks like this. So it lists all the testimony that happens to be for that committee for that day at that public hearing. You can click on these and read them. You can see where people are listing their names, the organization that they're affiliated with, and whether they support or oppose in many cases. So this person opposes this particular bill. And so all of the written testimony is listed here. Oral testimony can be either delivered virtually, so via Zoom. One of the things that COVID did for us, one of the few things COVID did for us was to have the General Assembly do things over Zoom, which is great. And they continued that after the pandemic was over, which is great. So we can submit our testimony. We can sign up for virtual testimony. There's a date that we need to sign up by. So it's usually the day before. Public testimony is 3 minutes, regardless of whether it's delivered in person or on Zoom. It is strictly enforced. You don't want to be in a situation where you're halfway through your testimony and the little bell goes off and they say you're done. So you need to obviously practice in advance to make sure your testimony fits in the 3-minute window. So testifiers are called for oral testimony in a posted speaker order. It's a random order. So people sign up. Let's say there's 20 people who have signed up to testify either in person or via Zoom. They will assign the order randomly. And it's typically posted 6 p.m. the evening before the public hearing. So you can find out when your testimony will take place, where you are in the list. And you'll find the speaker list at the top. If you look at this written testimony, there's a link, not at this particular example, but if there is, you'll see it. You would see it at the top of this page. So if you miss your spot, so you're signed up for testimony, you're virtual, they call your name and you're not there. They may give you another chance, but they may not. They don't have to give you another chance. So it's kind of important to be there when they call your name. They may ask questions following the testimony. So you want to be prepared for that. And you always want to submit a copy of your public testimony as written testimony. So typically you would write your testimony. Let's say you're going to do oral testimony. You would write it, you would submit a copy as written testimony, so that's there for the public record. Couple things to know. You don't need to be there for the entire hearing. So we've been at public hearings where there's 100 people who are registered. All you need to do is kind of keep track of where they are in the order to kind of get an estimate of when you'll be up. Certainly when you're ready, whether you're doing it via Zoom or in person, just kind of, before you begin, just kind of sit for a second, collect your thoughts, kind of, make sure you're kind of settled. You don't want to rush. You don't want to feel nervous. You probably want to do a little bit of advanced research to see who's on the committee and what district. Maybe your representative is part of this committee. So you want to make sure that you're recognizing or letting them know that you're a voter in their district. So in-person testimony is when we go to the LOB in a hearing room. There's a room number that gets posted as part of the public hearing notice. When we're called, so if when you're called to testify, there's a table in front of the legislators where we would go and take a seat, and there's a microphone, and we would just turn on the microphone and begin speaking. So again, speak slowly in a friendly voice. Certainly make eye contact with legislators, and certainly be there when you are called. You definitely, as I said, they may call you if you miss your time. They may call you again. They may not. And just make sure you answer any questions that they have directly, and obviously be respectful. Virtual testimony, so via Zoom, you'll receive an email with a Zoom link. You'll be placed in a waiting room. So everyone who's going to testify virtually is in a waiting room. When it's your turn, they'll move you out of the waiting room. The committee chair will invite you to speak. And then you will be projected on a screen behind the committee. So you don't want to have busy backdrops or backgrounds. You don't want to have the dog in the background chewing on a bone. You want to make sure that you test your lighting and audio prior to testifying. Have whatever notes or whatever you're reading from close to the camera so that you're looking up and your eye contact. Look directly into the camera and keep your audio on mute. So again, you don't want to hear the kids running around or whatever in the background. So this is a typical public hearing in person. This is a hearing room. You can see that the testifiers are projected on the screen behind the legislators. This particular one, there's just a couple legislators there. They all sit in a double row and the audience is behind them. So the three people testifying are me and Frank Burns from the Tourism Coalition and Jason Mancini from Connecticut Humanities. I think we're in front of the Finance Committee maybe at this point, talking about a bill that was meant to increase funding for the arts and culture in the state. So this is what the room looks like. So that's kind of the background of, I know I went through it quickly, but it's the background on how to find when public hearings take place, the different kinds of testimony, the places where you would look to find the details of who, what, when, and where. I want to pause just a minute, if there are any questions or thoughts at this point, and then I'm going to turn it over to Amrys, and she'll talk about telling a compelling advocacy story.
Great. Thanks, Brett. I wanted to there's been one question from Anne in the chat, which is kind of about ethics, going back to the beginning of our conversation. So she asks if the cultural districts, municipal commissions, which require minority distribution, if those are able to provide support to specific legislators, as well as monetarily support specific legislators. Obviously, nonprofits cannot, but is that something that cultural districts can do? Do you know?
I don't have an answer to that. I would suggest that's a great question for the State Ethics Office of Ethics.
Thanks, Anne, for that question. Are there any others before we move into the second half? I'm not seeing any hands or anything in the chat, so I'm gonna move on. Okay, great. Okay, we've already gotten a sense of how to get the basics of how to begin, signing up to give testimony. But whether you're preparing written or oral testimony, the first thing that you're going to want to do is do your homework. So the first step in preparing your compelling advocacy story is to do a little bit of research. Think about what is the change that you're looking for and what kinds of information, whether that's data or stories, anecdotal evidence, do you have to back up that position? One of the things that's been really fabulous are the action alerts that the Arts Alliance, Connecticut Humanities, and others have been putting forth, which provide really clear talking points. I know that many of you have probably seen these for the Arts, Culture, and Tourism Roadmap advocacy that we've all been partnering on. And these really provide some basic points that relate to the legislation under consideration. There are great resources here in Connecticut for where to find some of this data. The Arts Alliance has a data center that's focused on the arts community. And if you're looking for information on the cultural sector more broadly, including arts, humanities, history, museums, et cetera, you can go to the Connecticut Humanities data portal. They've collaborated with Wilkening Consulting on gathering a lot of information. So these are great places to begin your search for Connecticut-based data. And Todd was talking in the chat about historic preservation advocacy. I would, if that's your issue, Preservation Connecticut and Connecticut Preservation Action may also be places where you can find some Connecticut-specific information about your issue. There are a lot of sources beyond the state of Connecticut that are really wonderful to tap into as well. And these can provide important context, whether it's comparing Connecticut with other states, for instance, which can often be a compelling argument to make. We're looking for funding for this. Here's what we do in Connecticut. Here's what they do in Massachusetts or Rhode Island or New York that we think is more like what we should be doing or something like that. I know that this is an argument that we were making a lot around tourism investment, for instance. So we've included here some sources for both kind of the arts and museums sector. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but many of these organizations have advocacy as a key component of what they do. And as a part of that, they collect data on economic impact, on social impact, on educational impact. Three things that I think legislators are often really interested in seeing. What is the impact on communities, on workforce development, these sorts of things. And so all of these organizations from AAM to, the New England Museum Association, Americans for the Arts, the NEA, AAMD have wonderful sort of data centers that you can kind of mine. I know that AAM puts together like state-specific like infographic sheets on the economic impact of museums, for instance. And many of these other organizations have similar resources that you can tap into. And as Alyssa mentioning in the chat, we're going to be sharing all of this with you in our follow-up email as well. So you don't have to be scribbling these down. Okay, so the second step is sort of to develop your key points. What are the key messages that you want to get across? You don't have a lot of space or time because the most effective testimony is really going to be, short and sweet and to the point, clarifying what you're arguing for and why that is. So thinking about what those key points are. And as you develop those, it's really important that you think about this for a general audience who doesn't necessarily know a lot about the ins and outs of the arts sector or the ins and outs of working in a museum. So you want to avoid that kind of jargon, things that wouldn't be generally understood. Another thing that really makes your testimony incredibly compelling is having it be as personal as possible. You can lean into your work with your organization or a story from how the arts or museums or the cultural sector really impacted you and your family, or the impact that your organization has in the community. And data is really helpful, but having a story that has an emotional component that fleshes out what that data really means on the ground in Connecticut communities is really going to be the most effective kind of testimony. Obviously, as you're doing your homework, you want to be accessing reputable sources. We haven't pointed you to any non-reputable sources, but you can use your own judgment, making sure your data comes from those reputable sources so that, if someone asks you a follow-up question, you can talk about where that information came from. And often the follow-up questions are data related, or, tell me a little bit more about this. This is one of the things that I've seen in some of the hearings that I've attended. Another thing that's really great, and I always think about as, the testimony that's submitted on an issue is a whole constellation. And, you want to make your point a part of that bigger constellation. So one of the things that you can do as you're kind of doing your homework is take a look at the written testimony that's already been submitted, and get a sense for what you might be able to add to that conversation. And you can, you tap into your networks through the Arts Alliance and the League to talk with others and find out what they're talking about, so that you can bring your own dimension to that story. Okay. Step 3, preparing that testimony, doing the actual thing. So there are a few key things that you want to make sure are a part of your testimony. Really, and this applies to written or oral. You have the header, a salutation, an introduction, a statement of your position, your case to support that position, and your closing. So we'll go through these each in turn. And Brett has been kind enough to provide some examples from some testimony that he actually gave this legislative session. Okay, so the header. You want to make it clear what you are supporting or opposing. So usually these have to do with a particular piece of legislation that's either been proposed or is under consideration. So be sure you include the name and number of the bill, and whether you're supporting it or opposing it. And make sure that you include your name and, if appropriate, your affiliation, which can lend, I think, heft and gravitas to your testimony. So you can see this in Brett's header. And the salutation. So it is important to address the committee address the testimony to the committee in a formal way. And this is something that I always get a little stressed out about, I know. So it's great to have the guidance that that Brett has given us on the top of this, and going through the General Assembly's website where you can find all this information. And often these committees they have co-chairs, they have ranking members. Sometimes you'll be addressing your testimony to like half a dozen people. That's not weird. That is just how it works. And so he's offered a great example here of how you would address the chairs, the ranking members, and the vice chairs, as well as the rest of the committee in your salutation. So as Brett mentioned before, you want to say who you are, where you live, and what organization you're representing, if that's pertinent to the testimony that you're giving. And if you're talking about your organization, you want to just sort of briefly gesture at what it does. And this is one of the biggest things that, that I have taken away from this process, and I think is one of the greatest insights that you can think about. Don't talk about what your organization does. Talk about what the impact of that work, what that work does out in the community, because that is what legislators are really going to be interested in. You don't want to give a listing of we do this and we do this and we do this and these are the programs that we offer. You want to talk about the impact of those programs, and that should really be the emphasis. But really the point is to do this quite briefly, because as we said, you don't have a lot of space or time to get to the point. So I think one of the best ways to do this is to couch your description of what your organization does and its impact into what you're advocating for, or to the work of the committee. So, Brett has this great introduction here. My name is Brett Thompson. I'm a resident of Deep River and the executive director of the Arts Alliance, a statewide organization representing arts institutions, et cetera. Our work ensures that the arts are always a vital part of Connecticut's economy, our cities and towns, and the quality of life for our residents. That's a great example of showing the impact of what the CAA does. Okay, the meat of it. This is your argument. You want to state your position and begin to make your case for why that is. So I'll read from Brett's testimony. I join my colleagues at Connecticut Humanities, the Tourism Coalition, and members of the arts, culture, and tourism sectors in supporting HB 5490 and the state investments it will make possible for these important components of Connecticut's economy. It is a well-established fact that each dollar Connecticut invests in these sectors can return $3 or more in economic activity and tax revenue if they're adequately funded. We thank you for proposing such a wise investment on behalf of the people of our state. Like that sneaky thank you, right? Get that in there. The fact that the legislators are considering this is good. You want to give them a pat on the back for that, right? Make your case. So this is where you have a chance to really bring it, and this is going to be the most personalized part of this. You want to write a couple of paragraphs to really support your position. And again, we want to think about impact. So how would this legislation affect you, your organization's ability and its ability to serve the communities that it serves, the community that you live in, or that your organization works in. And this is where you can really lean into those personal stories. Maybe it's something that, a story from someone who visited your organization and what you saw as a result of that. Again, really focusing on impact here. Do you want me to go through the, yeah. Okay, so we can go through the closing. I think a lot of this is, it's really great to read through testimony in preparing your own testimony. And again, in closing, you want to restate your position. And again, thank the committee and ask them to support your position. So really, I think I often think, as someone who is trained as a historian, I think about this as like, you're making your argument. What is the evidence? What are the stories that you're going to bring to bear to support that evidence? And really making that sort of thesis statement the through line of your testimony. Okay, so you've done your testimony, written and oral. It's I think one of the things that I've learned that's really useful is to think again about your written and oral testimony as slightly different beasts. When you are submitting written testimony, it's something that people are going to be reading, and that's going to be different language than you're going to be using for something that you're going to be speaking to a group of people. So again, those are two different forms of writing, and I think it's good to be mindful of that. And it's also good to be mindful of the fact that you have kind of two opportunities if you're doing both of these in a way. You can put out like your big argument in writing, and then you want to pick that biggest story or that most affecting anecdote for your oral testimony that you're going to be delivering sort of live, whether in person or virtually. Following up, if you get asked a question, for instance, and you don't know the answer right there on the spot, but you say you can provide that information, make sure you do that. And then you also want to spread the word about what you did with your colleagues, your networks, so you can share your experience on social media or however you're communicating with others in your network. And think about what's next. So are there actions that you can take? You've already put in all of this work. Does this become an op-ed, something that you can share more widely? What are the things that you can do either on your own or in collaboration with others in your sector to move this issue forward? Okay, so these are some tips that we've put together, and we've mentioned these to some extent already, but I think they're worth emphasizing. So you don't want to have an anecdote that has no connection to any particular, concrete reality. On the flip side, you don't want to have numbers and figures without any emotional connection that legislators can make to understand the impact of that data. So I think that the wedding of data with storytelling is really something that makes for the most effective testimony. Again, this goes back to something we were highlighting earlier. Don't talk about what your organization does. Talk about what your work means and what its impact in the community is. We've also talked about the difference between sort of the written testimony and the oral testimony. With the oral testimony, they really will cut you off at that 3-minute line. And you do not want somebody interrupting you in the midst of, your stream of thought. It's very disorienting. It's very disconcerting. And it makes you look like you haven't done your homework and practice. So be sure to practice and make sure that your oral testimony really does fit in that 3-minute time limit pretty comfortably. It's when you're writing this out, it's not a lot. It's going to be like just a few paragraphs to be able to speak it, especially when you include the sort of formal greeting at the beginning where you're addressing the members of the committee. And as we said before, in thinking about follow-up, you can think about what you want to do with this piece of writing and speaking that you spent so much time preparing. Does it become a series of social media posts? Do you want to send a letter to the editor or write an opinion piece for one of the newspapers that allows your testimony to have a broader impact on the public level and is something potentially that legislators will also be paying attention to? Okay, I think that wraps up the main part of the content that we wanted to provide. So I think we can stop the screen share and open things up to Q&A.
So Amrys, I wanted to make a point for folks. So we went through this whole thing. We just spent 35 minutes telling you all the things you need to do and places you need to go. It doesn't have to be complicated. You don't have to feel intimidated. Legislators are very nice people. They're not grouchy. They're very respectful of people. They're there listening to maybe 100 people testify at a public hearing. And they're very gracious. So don't feel like you can't talk to them. Don't feel like you have to do it in a certain way. I've seen written testimony that's just 1 paragraph long. I've seen it 3-4 pages long. The most important thing for you to do is to do it. and do it in a way that makes sense for you, that feels comfortable for you, whether it's written or in person or via Zoom. Just do it. We are citizens in a democracy. This is your voice at the legislature.
Thanks for that, Brett. And I want to say like that sense of civic participation, like there's a little bit, I got to tell you that whenever I have given oral testimony, it's a little bit of a high afterwards. You're like, yeah, I did this like civic participation thing. I spent some time. It all happens really quickly, like you learn about the hearing and then you got to think about it and you got to do it. So it's a bit of a rush in both senses, like you're hurrying to do it. But when you have finished, it is very satisfying to know that you have weighed in on this important issue and that you have made your voice heard. So, I would definitely echo what Brett is saying is like, we've tried to break it up into sort of digestible bits, but the most important thing is to do it, however you do it.
The other thing I was thinking too is even if you don't feel comfortable doing in-person testimony, we encourage you, go to the legislature, go to a public hearing and just sit in the audience and see how it works. Being there, this is our government. These are the people we elected to lead our state. Going to the LOB, seeing it all, how the sausage is made is really cool, even if you're not doing testimony. So we encourage you to just go to a public hearing. I'm curious to know if there are any folks here today who have done either written or oral testimony.
Yeah, let's have a show of hands. Who's done this at all in whatever respect? A few.
So any thoughts folks can share? What was it like?
Absolutely. I've done this many times and I still learned a lot today. So thank you for doing this. But yeah, it is kind of a rush, and don't be intimidated by the fact that all the seats are not filled, because you will see a constant flow of legislators in and out. I mean, sometimes it's down to 2 people, sometimes they're full, but that's why it's so important to do written testimony, because everybody will look at the written testimony, theoretically anyway. And the other thing that I've learned over time is that if you have a legislator, if you know somebody who's on this committee, make sure they know that you're going to be there. Make sure that you've already talked to them about what you're going to say and what you're going to talk about, because then they can set up questions that will reinforce what you're doing. They can they can lead you in a way with their questions, and it really works out well. Of course, if there's nobody there, or if the people don't like what you're going to say, try not to do this. But it's been very useful. And also, when you're done, or when you're since there's constant flow, if you run into somebody in the hall, talk to them. It's human interaction that we're talking about here, and it's no different than any other human interaction. And it's surprisingly fun and useful to do. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Todd, for sharing your thoughts and experiences. It's really great to have those added to our conversation. So we had a question come in from John. Is written testimony shared between organizations who partner, perhaps posting on websites for shared action? We haven't done this yet. I mean, certainly when you provide your written testimony, it is accessible to the public in the ways that Brett laid out in the beginning, but it's an interesting thought. I don't know if you have anything from your perspective at CAA, Brett.
Not specific to answer that question beyond what you've said, but it did remind me that looking at written testimony can identify partners and advocates that you may not expect. So when we did, I think it was the the Finance Committee hearing for a bill that was going to add funding for arts and culture, one of the pieces of written testimony that was submitted came from a manufacturing association in one part of the state. I never would have thought, and they were supportive because they understood arts and culture were important to attract workers and to have a vibrant community. Never would have guessed that. So I'm, that person is on my to-do list to reach out to and say thank you and have a conversation. So written testimony can be really interesting to mine things like that from.
Yeah, and it's, John, to go back to your question, I mean, one of the things that we're going to be sharing as a part of our follow-up are some examples of testimony that Brett and I have given in this past legislative session. And we talked about whether we should pull examples of testimony from websites that, I mean, from the CGA website, on these, arts, culture, tourism issues that we thought was particularly good. And then we're like, well, maybe we shouldn't do that without asking people. I know it's a part of the public record, but people might be really surprised to see their testimony being circulated in these other ways. So we decided not to do that. But it was something that we've thought about. And I would just encourage you, because if you're like me, when you're learning a new form of writing or speaking, what you want to do is like ravenously read as much examples of what is already out there, so you can kind of understand what this form is like and what your angle is going to be like. What is the sort of element of your voice that you're going to bring to writing it or speaking in this way. So I think it's a really interesting question that you bring up. And I think Brett's story about making that connection is particularly relevant because it can, again, help you forge those relationships, even if it's not being facilitated by, an organization like the League or the Arts Alliance. But we are thinking about how to work effectively together, especially alongside our partners at Connecticut Humanities and the Tourism Coalition, as we think about putting forth a coherent voice on these issues here in Connecticut. And thanks to Kate for popping in the resource on sort of folklore advocacy. I think that, the lessons around how to do advocacy well, regardless of the discipline that you're working in, are really very much in common. And it's really just sort of what is the research and data and what are the stories of impact that you're bringing to bear to help support those positions. But the basic lessons are the same, whether you're, arguing for, just take manufacturing, right? Local manufacturing and workforce development, or, whether you're arguing for support for cultural organizations. Are there any other questions or things that people want to share about their experience, or things you're curious about, whether it's about the testimony portion of the advocacy process or anything else? Wow, Brett, we managed to do this in pretty good time.
We still have 15 minutes to eat lunch. Woo!
I know, right? Well, I want to thank all of you for being here. I hope you come away with this with some ideas. One of the things that we're trying to do in partnership with the Arts Alliance, with Connecticut Humanities and our other sort of statewide partners and strategic partners is, think about developing advocacy skills, out in the field as a year-round thing. That advocacy isn't something that you just do during the legislative session when you're giving testimony, but that it's also, what are the things that we can do to support those relationships? As Todd was saying earlier, these are human connections that you're forging with the people who represent you in government. And you can develop those relationships at any time of the year. It doesn't have to be during the legislative session when people are really busy, going to public hearings. So, I think you can look forward, hopefully, to seeing more programs and outreach from both our organizations to help everybody in the field really develop that as a habit, something that you do year round, that can render our testimony and advocacy during the legislative session more effective because those personal relationships are there. Is there anything you want to offer in closing, Brett?
I think you pretty much covered it. just to reinforce one of your points, probably the best time for you to sit down with your legislators is when the session isn't when they're not in session. It's pretty crazy when it is. They have a lot of responsibility and a lot of things going on. But inviting your legislators to sit down outside of the session for a cup of coffee at a local hangout. They love to talk with folks. They love to find out what's happening in their district. They like to talk to people. It's not like you're bothering them. They would be very happy to sit down with you. So think about this, as Amrys said, as not just something we do when they're in session, but it's something that we should do all year round, right? Creating those relationships with the people who represent your district, whether it be your local, your senator or your representative. Sit down and have a cup of coffee with them. Tell them what's on your mind. Tell them what's important to you. They pay attention. They listen.
And if you're at an organization that has like a bricks and mortar location, have them come visit. So that they can sit and so they can learn more about what you do. And when you come and speak at the next public hearing, they're picturing in your mind, your space, your site, and what it's doing out in the community. Yeah.
Well, and Amrys, you remind me that this is an election year, and legislators love to have pictures taken out in the public doing their thing. So if you have bricks and mortar, invite them to come out and visit. They can take pictures with smiling, happy people. They post them on their website. They love that stuff. So great opportunity.
Before we go, I just want to open the floor up to if there's more about advocacy in particular that you'd like to learn, what would be helpful to you? We'll be sending out a little bit of a follow-up survey, but if anybody has any ideas they'd like to share right now about things that would be helpful to you, please feel free to share them. I'll let you all think on that for a little bit.
Yeah, I think one thing that would help, is my mic on? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Maybe to help us regionalize organizations or resources. If I was like in the northeast corner where I am, if I wanted to visualize a map of these resources, where they are, where my partners might be, maybe partners I don't know are actually within 15 miles. Some way to regionalize this might accelerate communication for the next session and help people find each other more quickly, just beyond going to the website, but giving me a little map.
Yeah.
Just a thought.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Now, one of the, Association of Art Museum Directors has been doing this really great mapping project that talks about, I think if you go to their website, it's kind of like mapping the impact of organizations in their communities. But that I would recommend that you all check out, because I think it's a really great model for thinking about how to develop, imagery and, data that tells a story about economic impact. So that's one thing, but your point, John, about regions within Connecticut, because of course that's how things chunk out in terms of our representation, is really interesting. And I don't know, Brett, if you sort of track legislative districts for your members and other things like that. That's something that we don't do right now, but that we're looking to do. And I know it's something that Connecticut Humanities certainly pays attention to. But I wonder if there are, it's an interesting idea to think about how we can, I think at the statewide level, it's a really important role that we can play in connecting potential partners or people to work together within different portions of the state. Great idea, John. I think we'll have to think on it a little bit more, but I really appreciate that feedback. Yeah. I mean, we could do like local advocacy matchmaking sessions and just, but I think that, even organizing on your own, trying to get people together is also really good. But we do, I think we take your input and feedback really seriously. So thank you for that idea.
Yeah, and it reminded me too, maybe we could do something like, advocacy carpools or something. Even if folks just want to come to the LOB and see a public hearing, not necessarily be a part of it, but kind of maybe connect folks that way.
Yeah, that's such a nice idea. It can be such a, I've loved virtual testimony because I have a young kid and like, if the hearing's at 4 p.m. and we'll go until God knows when, I am not going to the LOB then, right? But it really is like, super great to be in Hartford, encountering people in the ways that folks have already described. So I love that idea. It's just another way to increase access to being able to participate in this advocacy, because it can be a lot of work and time. And, so I think anything we can do to lower those barriers is good. All right, Brett, Alyssa, Emily, thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for being here and sticking with us. And you can expect a message from Emily, in the next day or two with some resources and follow-up information and a little feedback form for us. So thank you so much.
Very cool. Take care, all.
Thank you very much. Thank you.